This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. If you'd like to take your seats and we will get started. You're all most welcome. My name is Dr. Orla Quinn and I am the Interim Director General here in the Institute, and I'm a former Secretary General of the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So I'm particularly pleased to welcome today our guest as part of the Development Matters lecture series, kindly supported by Irish Aid. And we have a very special guest in the series today, Dr. Annette Weber, who's the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa. And Annette will speak to us on a keynote entitled The Horn of Africa, Crisis, Conflict and Opportunity. Annette has been with as the EU Special Representative since July 2021. She brought more than 25 years of experience to the role, and she has worked in that region for many, many years. Indeed, she was engaged in mediation in Sudan and Ethiopia between 2019 and 2021 as a senior advisor at that time for the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue. She's been a professor of conflict studies, international relations and African international relations at a number of universities in Germany. When she was nominated as the EU Special Representative, she has a particular mandate to contribute to regional and international efforts to achieve peace, security and development within and among the countries in the region. We're extremely pleased to have her. She, again, has published extensively. Some of you may well be very familiar with her work on peace and security in the Horn of Africa. So before I invite Dr. Weber to speak to us, I would like to invite the Director General of Irish Aid, Michael Gaffey, to say a few words. This is, as I said, a series supported by Irish Aid. Can I also welcome those of you in the room and those of you online? And when we come to questions and answers, I'll just set out the little rules that we have. But again, just for everybody to be aware, this session is on the record and the Q&A is on the record as well. And I'll come back to that. So Michael, please join us. Thank you.
That's for you, Orla, not for me. Good afternoon, everyone in the room and everyone online on this real summer's day in Dublin. But I'm glad that so many people have come in person, and so many people are tuning in to hear from Annette. The Development Matters series is really important for us in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, because it remains the main forum that's available for discussion of, well, we say broadly of development issues, but what I always say is, in the world today and the uncertain world today, you cannot single out development from humanitarian, from political and security. All the crises that we deal with, all the opportunity that we should be creating involve a link between development, between humanitarian, between economic and political and security issues. And so it is really, really a great honor to have Annette Weber here with us today. In taking over the presidency of the European Union on the 1st of July, in preparing for it and looking at the Horn of Africa, I was worried for a while that we wouldn't have the benefit of Annette Weber as the EU Special Representative, because she has been in it since 2021, not 2001. But the happily agreement was reached between the member states and Annette that her term would be extended. So we do have that benefit, and it is really critical to us, because we've had, even last night and this morning, really, really good discussions with Annette. And she's got a title, Crisis, Conflict and Opportunity, because we always have to look to the opportunity, even at moments like this, when things look so difficult and so uncertain. And I just say that within the European Union, we find ourselves these days having too many debates, I think, on whether we should be acting in accordance with our values or in accordance with our interests. And actually, if there's a divergence between the two, that's too great, I think we're in trouble. And I don't think we need to have that debate to the extent we do. But what I can say is, looking at the situation in the Horn of Africa, you can see why it is really important for us to focus on that situation, because of our values and because of our interests, and for Europe and also for Ireland. The situation in Sudan, the conflict has created the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world. And that's not, and we don't address that just for humanitarian reasons. The situation and instability and potential instability across the Horn of Africa is also an issue that touches absolutely directly on the interests of the European Union. And we have seen that in recent months very much in looking towards the conflict at the Gulf, but now also in looking towards the relevance of the situation right across the Horn of Africa and in the Gulf and in the Red Sea. So I can think of nobody better actually to talk to us today and to answer questions than Annette Weber. And I want to welcome you and to say thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you this lunchtime. Thank you, Annette.
Orla, Michael, thank you so much for this introduction. It does not put pressure on me at all. But also thank you for inviting me a second time to come here. I think this gives me the opportunity to speak to an audience that has many of you I've seen here before. And I think that is helpful, because it also makes me feel that there is interest in this region, in the Horn of Africa. And for us in my mandate, it's the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. And I think, corresponding to what you said, it indeed is a question of values, but also interest. And I think I would like to start with a bit of a tour on the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. And of course, looking at the Red Sea right now, especially also after last night, again, we see the Red Sea becoming a vital lifeline for us. But I would like to end on the opportunities, and maybe not so much on what we would expect in terms of regional economic integration and how the region could feed itself and how it would be wonderful, but an opportunity that we are now, as the EU, working on a daily basis, and we feel very strongly about, is the political transition in Sudan and the work with the civilians that we do as members of the quintet. And I would like to end on this. But let me start really on what you have laid out. I mean, I don't want to talk too much about the Strait of Hormuz and the implications of the war in Iran, but we do feel these implications, and we had hopes that these implications could also have a positive spin, where Gulf countries, others could come together and see that what is necessary right now is to help to bring an end to the war in Sudan. And that has not happened. And I think that is a realization we need to grapple with. I'm just back from a Gulf tour. And I have to say, I think we are a tour of the Quad members in the Gulf and in Egypt. What we're feeling right now is that right now is really the crunch time for the Quad to make that move, to open this door, to get the parties to negotiate, to start negotiate. Because what we are doing as the EU is preparing for this day after, preparing what is necessary to not just have a negotiation that is ending in a void, but having negotiation that can be filled with something that can lay out a transition plan for the political transition, a transition plan for what is necessary after a ceasefire, how do you monitor a ceasefire, a transition plan that is also necessary for consolidating the civilian infrastructure. And I think this is what we've been engaging on for many years now, and would hope that there is the time right now to really get into the works, rather than hoping for the belligerents, to understand that a military solution might just not be what's happening. I don't believe in this mantra to say there is no military solution. I think many actors believe that, yes, of course, there's a military victory. But I think even if there's a military victory for a specific part of Sudan, this does not equal the end of the war. And I think this is because the new type of wars we're looking at, and I think last time I was here, we spoke still more about maybe northern Ethiopia. The type of war we see right now, of course, is a war that you don't need, tens or hundreds of thousands of troops. You need drones. And I think what we see in Sudan, it's turning into a drone war. And a drone war, indeed, is not a war where you see a military victory at the end if there is no if there is no negotiation, how to settle it. So I think what we see right now is a shift, and that shift is, of course, also a shift that brings the region or engages the region in good and bad ways. In bad ways, because we see war economy becoming an economy that is sponsoring interests in this region that are not for a consolidation and not for an end, to bring an end to the conflict in Sudan. What we see is a rotation of mercenaries from all neighboring countries. What we see is a connection from, you know, the Sahel into the Red Sea, a threat assessment that is growing. What we don't see is a region coming together, as we, you know, people are talking about, you know, the South Sudan negotiation, CPA. That was when the region was really active and leading. That we don't see right now. We see the region being split. We see part of the region, Egypt and Eritrea, clearly very closely connected to SAF, and we see the let's say more East African neighbors not so clearly, not necessarily siding with the RSF, but also clearly not in support of SAF. And I think this makes regional conflict settlement much more difficult, but necessary, because even if there's a settlement, be it in Jeddah or in Washington, it needs to come back and it needs to be owned by the region. It needs to be owned by the Sudanese first and foremost, but the region needs to be there, not just to sign, but to really own it. And I think this is what makes this, the complex situation in Sudan a regional situation. It's not just confined to Sudan. And this is not just a question, and Michael, you spoke about this, this is not just a question of being the biggest humanitarian crisis worldwide. And this is not just a question of the refugees fleeing into the regional neighboring countries. It really is also the question of the composition of the connectivity of the crisis, the war economy, the nature of the war, and the question of the state that is, well, let's say in discussion, but it's of course in the fighting between the civilian track. And we don't have one answer by the civilians on how the future of the state should look like in Sudan, how the army should look like. We have many answers. So there is no coherent voice. We have an answer by the SAF saying, you know, let's come back to the institutions we know. Let's consolidate the institutions. And we have little contribution by the RSF. We have some papers by Taziz saying that this could be a shiny new idea, but we have zero response from what they publish to what we see reality on the ground. So I think these issues are really making a settlement or one deal very unlikely. And I think we need to think in a process, we need to think in multi-layered, and we need to think and we need to bring back this multi-layered in the region and connect it to the Quad. Our role as EU, as I've said in the beginning, I think is quite, well, it's quite diverse as members of the quintet, as you know, working on protection of critical infrastructure, on IHL. We are now, in the absence of the US, the strongest provider of humanitarian aid, or the strongest financial supporter of humanitarian aid. But none of this is going to bring a solution if there is no political willingness by the belligerents and by the two parties to come and say what it is they want to see as the future of their country and how do we get there. And I think this is really the starting point that we are still struggling with. It's not about who is winning. It's about what do you have to put on the table for your population and how can we help you, and how can we help also the government in Khartoum, but also the people who are doing the daily work to get into, to make this a reality rather than to keep the reality of war ongoing. I spoke about the regionalization of this war. You had, you know, those of you who follow the Horn of Africa, of course, you know the interconnectivity. I mean, we have a nexus of conflict that connects Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. We, of course, are shuttling between all of these countries, trying to de-escalate. I think sometimes successfully, sometimes you see that there is an attempt between Sudan and Ethiopia, for example, to talk. I think there is a bit of readiness on regional economic integration between Eritrea and Ethiopia, but all of this could also not be the case and could lead into a war tomorrow. So we're not sure. We're not sure which way it's going. Everything is prepared for wars. there is readiness for discussion, but this is really something that is a very difficult calculation that we have right now. How do we bring the understanding and our engagement, our EU engagement, to consolidate a path that is leading to de-escalation and to regional economic integration? How do we bring the understanding that it really is much more beneficial for everyone, for the elite, for the people, for the population, for this region, to coordinate? They don't need to like each other, but to coordinate, to find ways to build bonds rather than keeping apart. And I think that is, that's a big question that can only be answered by the region. But I think the region has always been on this verge of falling into crisis. But I think right now we have at least 5 potential wars coming up. And so hopping from all of these, in my position as the regional EUs is becoming a carousel of de-escalation. I think this is really a bit of and of course I'm hoping to also have this discussion with you, because for us, what really matters is to take a step back and look at the region. We see that region as vital. The region is vital for our interests, because we need the region to function together. We need the region to be prosperous. We need the region to be ready to also counter what is coming. And this is not least, it's not least climate change that we not just see here with a bit of sun, but of course we also need the region to be able to work together and manage to find solutions for their own problems. We have the African Union, we work with the African Union, but we don't have a regional actor that is really doing this connectivity, that is bringing this region. So this is becoming more bilateralized rather than unified. And that is a problem. That is also a problem for the EU, because there is no secret for us right now with Ukraine, with Gaza, with Iran. It's really hard to keep Sudan on the attention, but it's much harder to keep Somalia, to keep Ethiopia, Eritrea, to keep the region also as a positive example, how the region could look like, rather than trying to firefight, outbreaks of conflict. And I think this is really the conundrum we're stuck in right now. We have ideas, the region has ideas, but every time you start working on consolidating, a new rupture comes up. I spoke about Sudan. I think I also need to speak about Somalia, because of course, with the US dropping UNSOS just last week, it's no surprise. We've heard this right in the beginning of the Trump administration, but it's becoming a huge problem. As EU for 18 years, we have been the main supporter, financial supporter for the AU mission, ATMIS mission before. And right now, it's clear, even if we continue as we are, it's not going to be enough. So is the region, and again, it comes back to a regional answer, is the region ready to have an answer to the question of Al-Shabaab? Is the region ready to find a unified security architecture where the region builds its own strength and connects and trusts each other? And how do we get there in basically a minute? Because right now we understand, the mission is not going to continue until 2029. We cannot have this mission or the security in Somalia collapsing. SNA, SNF is not yet ready to fully provide the security in the country. We need the region. But of course, the risk, again, is that the region is bilateralization or is bilateralizing their requests. And we, as the EU, are not there to tell the region, this is your new architecture. The region needs to come up with an architecture. But how can we facilitate, how can we help, how can we support this regional architecture that is important for the region, as I said before, but of course also for our interests, not just in the region, but also in the Red Sea. You're looking at this region and you're looking at Red Sea, you're looking at not just our trade, but you're looking at our connectivity, you're looking at your internet. If the Red Sea is not secured, our internet communication, our internet cables, our data cables will be at risk. So it's a very profound interest we have right now. And looking at the Strait of Hormuz and the flare up again, the MOU is not holding, we need to shift our focus on the Red Sea for shipping, but of course also for securing. So therefore, and this is maybe where I end the regional tour before going to the Sudanese civilian track, This is what we're engaging now in the EU on a Red Sea task force inside the EU, but also where we're trying to see, not just with the littoral states, but also with the states affecting and being affected by the Red Sea, how can we have a discussion that is basically a waterway that connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, that is a waterway that is in the interest for all of us to be a secure waterway. How can we have a discussion about this? And how can we then build on the assets we have as Peters and Atalanta, who are still there, who we want to keep there, who we want to bring more ships to guard our trade ships, and of course, where we also want to keep Atalanta as a counter-piracy force. How do we bring this in a larger discussion that is not just EU doing something in the Red Sea, but it is a conversation that we have with the region on both sides of the shore, the Horn of Africa side, as well as the Gulf side. Not easy these days, because as you can see, we have a Gulf competition, and you can see that very clearly in Sudan. We have a Gulf competition, of course, also in the Red Sea, but we need really to bring all of our assets together and our thinking together, because if what we see in the Strait of Hormuz is becoming a norm, it's not going to be a solution for the Red Sea. And is becoming a norm is also a question of reducing norms. For example, UNCLOS. What we see in the Strait of Hormuz is an end of UNCLOS, could be an end of UNCLOS. If there is no unified norm, we will see, of course, non-state actors like the Houthis claiming, basically following the example of Iran and now Oman as well, collecting taxes. And I think I just open this as, as a Pandora's box, because you can make up your own thinking, and being in a place like Dublin where you have direct access to the sea, you can imagine what this would mean, not just for our trade, but for the norm setting of the law of the sea. And for our interaction. So I think there are many ideas, many questions, many openings, but I think also a growing threat analysis that is very clear, and a growing problem for having reduced regional alignment, having much more bilateralization for the region to connect to outside actors, and having a war in the midst of it, and that is the Sudanese war, that is not just a Sudanese war anymore, that has become a regional war with people benefiting from the war economy. So it's not just a war that everyone in the region wants to find a quick end, but of course it's also a war that is eating all the neighbors, and all the neighbors are starting to eat into that war. So this could become not just a partition, or not just a problem where you have, Khartoum not having a reach into Darfur, but it could really become a situation where you don't have any of the structures from before, where you have a full fragmentation, much worse than Somalia 91. And bringing this back, I don't think the region or anyone outside is ready. So I think it's really high time to work on a substantive change right now. But with the lay of the land of international actors, regional actors, it's going to be not an easy answer. What we have been focusing on with the quintet, and I think that's where I would like to come to, is I think something in the beginning it felt like, and it was seen by Burhan and others as a sideshow. Working with the civilians, okay, it's a nice thing the EU can do, it's a nice thing the quintet can do. Now, I think it's becoming clear that the quintet, let's say that the Sudanese in the Berlin conference managed to align themselves across the political landscape to come up with a paper with a statement, not for the outside world, but for the Sudanese inside, to say, okay, we need to focus on stopping the war and taking next steps to a civilian transition. This is not about our differences. This is not about our political positioning. This is not about where we come from. This is not about how we see the future of Sudan. But what we agree on is that that future needs to be an end to the war and a civilian transition. And now, what we now hopefully doing next week, 2 weeks, going back to Addis, we're moving from working with the civilians or working with the political actors on, procedural issues. And procedural issues, all of you who've been in mediation, is not an easy thing, because you're talking about representation, you're talking about who is in, who is out, you're talking about, who has a say and who is not. And this we gave to the Sudanese to figure out themselves, but I think we're getting to an end to this and starting to work on substance. And I think substance to me is really a way out of the problem of fragmentation across the board, but also into the shaping of the future. And I think this is something where we can bring the civilians inside and outside Sudan, where we can bring the parties, even the belligerents, to a conversation that is shaping the future rather than destroying the now, the presence. And I think that is a shift. My sense is there is a bit of an opening. There's also a bit of a shift in the Gulf, but we don't know how long this is holding. We don't know if it's really becoming, a shift, a tangible shift. But I think right now is really the time to move quickly on the civilian transition, to move quickly on the political track. And of course, it's also time to bring all of our efforts to get to ceasefire. So I'm very lucky also to be here, just at the beginning of Ireland's presidency of the EU, because we've been actually, as you say, Michael, we've been quite, we worked on tangible things that we can do together during your presidency. And I think this is important to highlight not just the horrible situation in Sudan, but to also highlight the solutions that could be there, to bring it on a higher level, to include, Foreign Affairs Council, to include our leadership, to make Sudan really a focus that it deserves and its people deserve. And I think this is really a bit of, I feel encouraged being here discussing with you. I feel encouraged that there is a way that we can collectively work on the issues, but also find solutions. So let me end on this positive note. Very happy to dive very deep into all the details of all the countries and beyond. But I just wanted to lay the land for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weber, Annette, for that overview. And it is so extensive, and you are clearly so in tune and on top of the brief. I'm going to open the floor for questions, but I'm going to take the liberty of being the chair and ask a couple of questions myself first. But for those of you who are in the room or online, when I open for questions in a couple of minutes, please just identify yourself, your affiliation, and again, I'm sure there will be lots of questions, so I'll ask people to keep their questions short, if I may. And also, as I mentioned earlier, it is all on the record. So again, just for people to be aware of that. So can I start, Annette? Our previous speaker in the Development Matters series was our Minister of State, Neil Richmond, who has visited the region and has, I suppose, at our previous, really talked about the priorities for the Irish presidency. So maybe just the question to yourself, in terms of Ireland now holding the presidency, how can they, I suppose, support the EU, support you in your role, to try and make progress on this really difficult conflict?
Well, thank you for this question. And of course, I don't want to tell you what I hear from the Foreign Ministry, but I think what I feel very much encouraged by is the understanding that we need to focus, to make Sudan more a priority, to make it a priority on the humanitarian situation, but to not isolate the humanitarian from the political. So connecting the question of how do we get to a ceasefire, bringing this on a higher level of engagement on ministerial levels. And I think this is really, let's say, the best of a positive storm. Because if we connect all the entry points, all the tools that we have, that is clearly humanitarian, that is also the political. If we connect this, I think all of this will bring a much stronger dynamic and a much stronger dynamic of an Irish-led in the presidency of the EU. And as I said, I mean, we're working on some of the tools. We're working with the African Union on the political track, but how do we bring this also more to our own, domestic audience, that it's not just a war that is creating the biggest humanitarian crisis, but also that there are people working on a solution, and that these people are Sudanese people, and that they are doing this for months and months now, and that we can highlight that. We spoke about Somalia, because there we feel this was a shock to everyone that the US is dropping UNSOS. But we have been preparing for this. We've been preparing by talking to the defense ministers of the region. We are a bit ahead of the curve, and I think under your leadership during the presidency, I think we can make use of this. We can make use of our own Schuman Forum, for example, to focus on something where we're good at. We can focus on something where we are already providing security in the Red Sea. And basically thinking about, can we have a talk with others, maybe during UNGA, to see what could the conversation not just look like, but how can we connect what we have in terms of assets, Aspides, Atalanta, to a broader conversation, for example, Red Sea Council and others. So I think we have quite a number of ideas. I think they're very tangible and operational. And I think that's a perfect prep for the presidency.
Yeah. You mentioned in your talk just the importance of the region, indeed to the EU more generally, but across global. And I was struck just with some of the data when you see it. That nearly 15% of global traffics through the Red Sea, or 90% of cables between Asia and the EU are again coming through the Red Sea. It echoes, and I just see here a question in from Sulana Maitra from the UCD Centre for Humanitarian Action. And she's asking, do we need to articulate the hard geo-economic interests in the region and really try and be more effective from that perspective, that people might understand better and take more heed of it if they understood it better?
Yes, absolutely. No, because I think, and this is not versus, it's not interest versus, our EU DNA and values. It really is something where we can get stronger, but we also need to make people understand, why are we talking about the Red Sea? Why is that important? And I think, we have a lot of discussions where it's about humanitarian. We have a lot of discussions about where it's about migration. But the core interest right now is really Red Sea security, because we're depending. I mean, we totally depending on the security and to keep the underwater connectivity running. We've seen, it might have not been an attack on cables, but we've seen some cables being damaged. We've seen Houthi attacks. If we're looking at development, where basically the Houthis are training Al-Shabaab right now to assemble drones, we could see a perfect negative storm where basically we have dirty drone, aggression on our shipping lanes, but of course also on the underwater connectivity. So I think we need to be much more clear to also our population and say, look, this is an inherent interest. And this is why we need to have a conversation with the region, but also move. And we have Aspides, we have Atalanta. We also need to have a better understanding with the region. How can we bring this into a regional security architecture on sea and on land, but not hoping that it's happening and then financing it, but also coming out with our ideas.
Okay, thank you. It's tricky issues. I am going to open it to the audience. So again, if I ask people to put up their hands, I have one gentleman here at the back. I'll take you first, and then there's another gentleman here. Let me just say.
Thank you very much. Adekunle Gomez from the African Cultural Project. The title of Dr. Weber's talk is From Conflict and then Ended with Opportunity. Now, I'm from the other side of Africa, by the way, the West, but I still kind of, feel very much for what is going on there. Yeah. Somebody said, in the midst of difficulties, it's nice to mention something positive. Now, when I came across Somalia, one of the things I heard was a nation of poets. And it's significant that we are gathered in a nation which is called the land of saints and scholars. So that's the positive side. My question is, Dr. Weber, you mentioned the quintet. I wasn't sure, who that's referred to. So possibly if you can, remind me who the quintet involved. But my question then is, when you talk about involving outsiders, I was wondering whether there is a role for East Africans who are living in the diaspora, because I kind of, they always think that those who have come from there and they are living here, they have the language to communicate, to explain the situation. So it's nice to know if those who from the region and in the diaspora have a role to play in this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Do you want to take that one?
Yes, no, really, thank you so much. And I'm very sorry, of course, there's so many quintets. On Sudan, the quintet is really all the multilaterals. So it's the African Union, it's the United Nations, it's the EU, it's the League of Arab States, and it's the regional organization, it's IGAD. And I think this really is a first, that we all come together. Even so, we have very different ideas of how we can strengthen and support Sudan. And also different, access and relations to Sudanese inside. But we managed to basically have all the principles, and we meet on a very regular basis. Basically, we have consultations with the Sudanese, I feel like now every month, where, and this gets to your next question, where of course we have Sudanese who were forced to flee because of the war. We have Sudanese from inside, and we have also diaspora people who are Sudanese who have spent a lot of time already outside or who were born outside. So it's really a mix. It's also a mix of people across the political landscape. People who feel very close to SAF, people who are in Taziz. We have people who I would say are, very progressive and who've been to the street during the revolution in Sudan. We have people who feel closer connected to let's say moderate Islamists. So it's really across the spectrum. And of course, what we're trying for the quintet is not possible for everyone in the quintet to agree to everyone in this political spectrum. Just to give you one example, but I really am proud that we managed to find a way how to deal with this. League of Arab States, for example, doesn't want to sit in a room with Taziz, those who are politically affiliated with the RSF. But we managed to bring all the civilians there. We open, and then we leave it to the Sudanese. So if the Sudanese wish to have conversation with the RSF, with the Taziz, the space is there. We're not telling them what to do. We don't have an agenda. What we want is to have, we have facilitators to help basically getting from step 1 to step 2. But this is really open, and everyone agreed in the quintet that even so we might not, as our institutions, have affiliations or have a red line, we feel what the Sudanese are telling us is our guideline. So far, the Sudanese are telling us they're ready to meet with everyone except the old regime. To be very honest, if the Sudanese are telling us they want to include the old regime, it should be entirely up to them. So this is really something where I feel, 20 years ago, when I was involved in facilitation, mediation, I think we had a much stronger agenda from outside or from the mediator side. I think this is really something where I feel it's owned and driven by the Sudanese, but what we need, and it goes back to a bit to your question, is also the ownership of the region. So we have the African Union as a chair, but we also need the region and the regional countries to be in support of, basically how to support the future and the shaping of the future that is decided by the Sudanese for the Sudanese.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have a few questions here online, but I was going to take one question here and then did you have your hand up? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weber. George Steiger from Department of Foreign Affairs. I think your last answer actually went quite a way to answering my question. But my question is, what are the lessons that we've learned from the mediations between 2019 and April 2023? And how are those going to be used to have a genuinely civilian-led transition?
Super difficult question. No, because I think, everything has changed. Everything has changed in terms of mediation because we don't have a default mediator. It was always the UN. You would always have the UN as a mediator. That's gone. You don't have a default structure of mediation where you have, experts and you have the lead mediator, one person, almost always from outside, with the exception of CPA, and then you have a secretariat. That's gone. No one is requesting this, and we don't have it anymore. And so I think we reinvent mediation as we go. And I think it's not a mediation anymore. It really is much more facilitation. It's not that process that many of us have, learned and practiced. It really is a facilitation. It's a very different approach. It's taking the ego away and leaving basically the flow of the matter to those who want to shape their own future. But of course, we bring in experts and we bring in expertise, but we bring that in upon request. So we're not saying this would be a great agenda. Why don't you do the constitutional discussion first, and then you go into, the nature of state, and then, building basically governance, and then you can do a bit of SSR, and then you can do this and that. What we say is like, okay, what do you need for that process to be an inclusive process? And I think this is where we are still keeping a very mediation-oriented approach to say it cannot be a partisan process. It's not good enough for one side to pick some civilians and say that's a mediation or this is a civilian process. It has to be inclusive. But how inclusive is really up to those in the room to decide. And of course, you need to bring everyone into the room for them to decide. So I think there is, I don't know if it's more democratic, but it's less individual mediator driven. It's not the default. And I think we're building the plane while we're flying. And I think that's really the beauty of it, but of course it's also the risk. My sense is also what has changed is this idea of a mediation, and you in this country are the best to understand this. We have a lot of transactional expectations. Why are the Sudanese not yet signing a constitution? Why is that not yet mediated? Why is that not yet done? Can we do this in 6 months? No one can do a mediation or a facilitation in a time frame that we wish, to find a solution. It takes years. It can take a minute, but it can take decades. We need to be prepared for this. But of course, it's not about taking decades. And I think this is a bit of the necessary work we also need to do to our systems, back to our systems, to explain if we say mediation takes time, it doesn't mean we want to make, it cozy and sit there and wait. It is a process that is a constant engagement, but you cannot predict that that it takes you 3 months and then you have a budget for 3 months and then it needs to produce an outcome. It will produce an outcome, but it's not holding if there's no buy-in by the participants. So I think it's an extremely important question, and I think the answers need to come from various sides. But I think there's also a need for better discussion of, also from the participants, from the actors. What do they need? Because sometimes you also have, and you know this from other mediations or facilitations, you have this fatigue of those who are basically totally overwhelmed from the war in their country, who need to survive, who need to also see, do I have a future as an individual, as a family? Is it inside, is it outside? Is it in affiliation to one of the blocks? There's a fatigue to really do this everyday work of sitting down and talking about almost abstract things. How do you build a country? How do you build a state? And I think this is sometimes where we get the request to just bring the solutions and to not fall into that. And this is not just for the civilian, it's also for the belligerents. Very often they say, just bring us, just bring us a paper. But we know what it means. You bring a paper, and rightly so, they say that, but this is not ours. So it really is this kind of back and forth. How do you shape your own future, and how can we support that?
Maybe I'll take a couple of related questions, Annette, on that topic, just to follow on from it. So Linda Rempis, who's online, has asked, as geopolitical competition in the Horn of Africa intensifies, what comparative advantage does the EU offer compared with other external actors? And how is the EU's engagement perceived by local stakeholders? A similar question from Sean Burke. What efforts are being made at the EU level to encourage member states and non-EU states who directly support or who have influence on the belligerent parties in Sudan to find a solution to the conflict? And maybe just finally, an IIEA member, Brigadier General Gerard Hearn, who's a former commander of the EUTM in Somalia. And he mentions that the 3 EU CSDP missions in the Horn of Africa, EUTM, Somalia, OP Atalanta and EUCAP, seem to be never-ending with questionable outputs and end states. And he asks, it's quite a colloquial question, is it overdue for the EU to stop providing the fish and concentrate on the fishing rod instead in the Horn? So that's, I suppose, for the EU to be more...
Let me answer the last first, because I think CSDP missions are precisely the fishing rod and not the fish. Because it really is enabling the capacities in country to do the work rather than just sitting there. And so, yes, the question is exit strategies. But it cannot just be exit strategies. It's also where, and it comes back to the Red Sea in my understanding on Somalia. Where's our interest and what kind of capacities do we need? We need many more naval capacities from the Somalis. If we want the Red Sea to be basically, a safe passage, we cannot keep Aspides there forever. We need the capabilities from the countries, but we also need, we need capabilities, and we have zero, almost zero in Somalia and of course Somaliland and Puntland in specific. So I think it's also a question of not just, okay, we've been there for too long on EUTM, let's just end it. But what do we need? What is our interest? What do we need? And how does that fit into a regional conversation about security on land and on sea? And I think this is really where we need to be maybe more bold, more flexible, but not so black and white, either yes or no. But I think, that would be my answer to this. I mean, well, it's interesting because it goes a bit to the assumption from the last question that basically we always seen, or we have been as EU have been seen, and we call it like we're seen as the ATM. That should clearly not be our aspiration. But we are also seen as the most predictable partner right now. We are the only predictable partner, I would say, in many cases. That is, of course, not just positive because we're always there. We're not never moving away, regardless of what's happening. But of course, it is a basis that we need to work on, that we need to work with. We need to be, I think, more bold, more visible. We need to have a discussion again on the Red Sea that is not just EU is providing. It's like, what are you putting on the table? But I think it is a position where we have an advantage because we are trusted, we are seen as reliable, and we are seen as, let's say, again, it's a mixed bag without a lot of agenda. Yes, but we do have interests. We might not have the agenda. It's not a transactional engagement of the EU, and we're coming into one country and taking whatever critical resources or critical minerals. It's not this kind of transactionality, at least not now. So let's build on this. Let's build on, you know, the basis that there is trust, that there is confidence in the EU, that there is an understanding that we are a reliable partner. But I think we also need to evolve to ask more from the partners on the ground. And I think there, again, you know, on Sudan, I think we are working on this. On Somalia, my sense is by traveling in the region, you get more and more of an understanding that it's not forever that the EU is going to pay, you know, for example, on an AU sum. And so the beginning 2 years ago was a shock. It's like, okay, what are we going to do if you're not paying? Right now, my sense is the region is thinking about what is their interest, what do they need to avoid? They need to avoid a spread of al-Shabaab. They need to, you know, keep a strong regional, strategy with the Somalis to counter. And I think there we can come in a different way, rather than just being the ATM to pay AU sum. We can be part of shaping this. And I think there we do have, maybe because of the absence of the US, we do have a different role that is based on our reliability and the trust the countries have, but also in a more advanced and more visible interest-based foreign policy. Thank you.
Could you say a word, Annette? It was struck me when I was reading for this event, the huge increase in violence against women. I saw some figures in the latest UN report that it's gone from about nearly 13 million women and girls suffering violence and sexual violence from 3 million in 2023. Just, it's a huge, huge impact. I just wonder, would you say a word on that in terms of why it's happening, and then are there particular actions being taken to address that?
It's happening because they can, and because rape is always a weapon of war. It's been like this in the first Darfur war, and it's not just a weapon of the war to humiliate a group. It's also a weapon of war, and we've known this from the first Darfur war. The war songs, the Janjaweed back then were singing, and mind you, it was women singing, the Janjaweed women singing these songs, was to say, you Africans in Darfur, you will not be Africans anymore. So it's much more than just a humiliation on one particular ethnic group. It is also a change of demography. So it's really, it's such a cruel and violent way of shaping a new power base. What can we do? I think what we have done last time was I think we need to do many more things, but I think one thing that we need to do is being very clear that if we ask women to be witnesses, we need to be able to protect them. What happened last time was that we had a lot of interviews by NGOs, by ICC, asking women to be witness of their own predicament or violations against women or children in their families, and we were not able to protect them. And I think this we need to get to be so much better, because we cannot use the evidence that we then don't use and put women through a double burden because we don't protect them afterwards. So I think we need to think protection of gender-based violence and rape as a weapon of war much larger. And I think that is something we are missing out in many of the conversations, because they are conversations about, you know, humanitarian access, or it's conversations about ceasefire. But this is really profound, and it's massive. It's not just an attack on an individual person and her body. It really is a message to a society. And I don't think we have found the answer, but it needs something that is much bigger, and we need to be much more careful by asking women to come and testify.
Thank you. Can I check in the room? We're coming near the end, and I have 1, 2, and 3. Let me start over here with yourself. And if I can ask you to be brief in your questions, so we can just manage to fit in the last 3, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Hazel from the DFA. Just going back to you're saying the importance of not isolating the humanitarian from the political. I know that humanitarian actors have been very keen to emphasize that separation. For example, unhindered humanitarian access is a principle that should be completely separated from a ceasefire, and it's based as a core principle that is regardless of the progression of war and peace. And of course, the core humanitarian principles of independence and neutrality. So how do you ensure that you can connect the humanitarian and political, but still ensure you protect those principles?
Okay,
just
thank you.
to add briefly to that, adds to a question by Sulana Matra in the UCD. She talks about that blurring of lines between humanitarian and peace, and again, a sharp rise in attacks on humanitarian staff. Can I ask you to pause, and can you take 3 questions?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then I'll manage to fit everybody in. Gentleman here.
Abdulrazak from Somaliland. I previously worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Somaliland as a strategic advisor during the Ethiopian MOU with Somaliland, which a lot of people might say put the region in difficult time, but also afraid Ethiopia to invade Eritrea for sea access. I would like to ask you, you didn't touch about the recurrent Tigray problem, especially within the Ethiopia, and you also you didn't touch on the recent Israeli recognition of Somaliland and how that might put on EU, European Union, African Union cooperation into much larger burden to focus on. And one final observation is that, as an African, we must see as a EU not kind of a strategically partnering in Africa like they are doing, like you guys are doing with the India, like recent deal with India, or you are doing with Brazil and Latin American. And your analysis of your policies, most of it, although now they are shaping, but still they are more on humanitarian focus. And as the director Michael says here today, will you kindly, for the next few years, and especially the Irish and EU presidency for this 6 months, could you guys focus on more on strategic cooperation with African Union or Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of AI and other substantial issue that EU and economy needed now? Thank you very much for your time.
Final question here, gentleman here.
Thanks very much.
He's really brief because we want to give Annette
Absolutely.
time to answer.
Rory Mulcahy, I had no current affiliation. I was actually just going to piggyback on the question of Somaliland, which was when we're looking at Somaliland and you're talking about the EU as a reliable actor, a big thing for Somaliland obviously being recognition. So when there are states that are willing, or external actors willing to use recognition as a chip in bargaining, does that put the EU at a slight disadvantage, or is there a way that the EU thinks that it might be able to offer something as strong as that in any kind of negotiations with Somaliland? Thank you.
Okay. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Maybe I was not clear in what I said about humanitarian and political, because that is very clear. Of course, it cannot become one. It was more a response to the Irish presidency, that we're not thinking in silos and in isolation and looking at Sudan as a humanitarian case, without also thinking, what do we need to do on the political track, and how do we basically mobilize also the public, that it's not just a country where people are suffering, but also a country where people are on the political track, keeping shaping their own future. There is something positive. So it's absolutely clear. We need to keep the political and the humanitarian on the ground separate. However, of course, my role is also to hammer it in and remind political decision makers, including Hemeti, that attacks on humanitarian workers are not just unacceptable, but it's, you have atrocities, you have war crimes that are committed when you attack civilians, when you attack humanitarian workers on a scale that are not just, happening. Well, I don't know the legal term, but I think it's very clear. he needs to be clear that this is going to be a question of accountability. They need to be clear that if they continue to do that. And I think this is where, of course, the political comes in. But no, absolutely, humanitarian political needs to be two separate, but we need to think beyond these silos. Somaliland, I mean, you know, the EU is not recognizing countries. But of course, I mean, what we do is working with Mogadishu as the federal government. We also, I mean, I go to Hargeisa because we also have an interest in the, you know, on the shore. We work with political entities also from federal member states. And I think in Somalia, what we had started with our joint roadmap was precisely this. We said our investment in security in Somalia can only work if there's a political alignment. And this political alignment needs to come from inside. It needs to come from Mogadishu sitting with Hargeisa, Mogadishu sitting with, you know, with Puntland, with Jubaland, with federal member states, and vice versa. They need to consider their region, if it's a federal, confederal, if it's whatever. This is not our decision. But they're only strong if they work together. Now, of course, we see a shift, and you know, I think what we've seen in the beginning is there was. I think it made Somaliland a bit more vulnerable because it was a recognition by only one country. But I don't think we see the end of the story. What we don't want to see is an either or. We don't want to see it's, you know, strengthening of Hargeisa is a weakening of Mogadishu. We need all of them working. Because of course, why we are there is to support the Somali population if they're from wherever, but we also need to see all of them working in one direction against Al-Shabaab. And this is why we have the mission. And I think this is where it's not so difficult for us actually to think beyond Mogadishu or to think beyond the Somaliland, Somalia. It really is the purpose for our presence is really, you know, minimizing Al-Shabaab, minimizing the threat, and finding a solution that is a security solution where everyone walks in one direction rather than fighting each other. And I think that's, yeah, I would say. Tigray, yes, of course, it's a very different situation right now. Difficult also what I said before in terms of, because it's the Tigray dimension, the TPLF Debrecen faction with Eritrea dimension, the Sudan dimension. So the Tigray war was an Ethiopian war. What we see right now is part of a regional fragmentation. Everyone is hoping to have allies in the neighboring countries to strengthen their position. What we see is happening is a weakening of all three countries. Clearly not what we want to see. And of course, we are hoping, again, with our shuttle diplomacy, to have an understanding that if they all want to prosper and if they all want to have a stronger, you know, realization, even also for their own population, why they want to stay there, why they want to go back there, why they want to see their country as a country with a future, they need to see themselves as part of a region rather than individual countries. I mean, I think if there's anything we've learned as the EU is the strength comes from us as a region. It's not the individual countries next to each other. It's really how we act as a region. And I think this is really what, you know, we're looking at. It's the opposite what we see in Tigray right now.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Annette Weber. I think we've had an amazing overview of a region and a conflict and a whole area that was not, and I'm delighted, as I said earlier, this is your second visit to us. We will hope to see you again. Can I thank again the Department of Foreign Affairs for their support for this series, Development Aid. Can I thank our own team here in the Institute, particularly Jill Donoghue and Avin, who have set up this event for us today. It is clear we are facing such global problems and tensions in the world. This institute provides a forum for those discussions to take place. Those of you in the room who are not members of the institute, can I invite you to join? you can talk to our staff or you can visit us online. And our final question of the series today was from Molly Magaffin, and she asked how engaged is the Irish government and Irish presidency on this particular topic, but for any EU or international related topic, can I direct you, Molly, to our website? And I mentioned our Minister of State, Neil Richmond, spoke on this topic earlier, but absolutely to invite people to be part of this discussion and part of this institute. Thank you all for your presence online and here today. Thank you. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.